From San Francisco, California, this is Democracy Now!
We call it Tent City. It's terrible. In fact, we just sent a violation to the city of San Francisco. Unsafe water, unsafe conditions, environmental. EPA, our EPA, which is doing a great job, is sending Nancy Pelosi, with all the talk about EPA, there's needles and drugs all over the street. There's tents. There's people that are dying in squalor in the best location in San Francisco.
Trump versus California. The president attacks the city of San Francisco again as the EPA issues a violation notice to the city, falsely claiming San Francisco's homelessness crisis has caused water pollution. Meanwhile, the Trump administration recently revoked California's authority to set stricter auto emission standards, but the state is fighting back.
Transportation alone in our state is responsible for 29% of all greenhouse gases. We're already seeing the way greenhouse gases and climate change are affecting our state, from wildfires and droughts to superstorms, floods, and mudslides.
Plus, the California legislature votes to ban private for-profit prisons, including private immigration jails. The bill is now awaiting the governor's signature. We'll get the latest. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Democratic lawmakers warned President Trump Wednesday they're preparing to subpoena White House officials to produce documents related to Trump's efforts to pressure the president of Ukraine to investigate Trump's political rival Joe Biden and his son Hunter. House Intelligence Chair Adam Schiff, the California Democrat who's leading the impeachment investigation, said he's deeply concerned that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo vowed to block current and former State Department officials from being questioned. And Schiff denounced President Trump's attacks on the unnamed intelligence official who blew the whistle on Trump's interactions with Ukraine.
The president wants to make this all about the whistleblower and suggest people that come forward with evidence of his wrongdoing are somehow treasonous and should be treated as traitors and spies. This is a blatant effort to intimidate witnesses. It's an incitement to violence.
This comes after Secretary of State Mike Pompeo acknowledged he was on the July call when Trump spoke to the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Meanwhile, the Washington Post reports Trump enlisted Vice President Mike Pence in his efforts to pressure Ukraine's new leader. According to the Post, Trump ordered Pence to skip the inauguration of President Zelensky in May and later had Pence tell the Ukrainian president that U.S. military aid was still being withheld while demanding more aggressive action on corruption, which we would have understood included an investigation into the Bidens. President Trump reacted with fresh outrage Wednesday to Democrats' impeachment inquiry, tweeting, quote, "The do-nothing Democrats should be focused on building up our country, not wasting everyone's time and energy on bullshit," Trump tweeted, using the four-letter expletive. Trump then lashed out at his enemies from the Oval Office, saying Congressmember Schiff couldn't carry Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's, quote, "blank strap," a reference to a jockstrap. Trump also repeated his claim that he's a very stable genius. Later in the day, Trump appeared with Finland's president at a joint news conference where he refused to answer questions from Reuters White House correspondent Jeff Mason about his July phone call with the Ukrainian president.
Look, Biden and his son are stone cold crooked, and you know it. His son walks out with millions of dollars. The kid knows nothing. You know it, and so do we. Go ahead, ask a question.
But the question, sir, was what did you want President Zelensky to do about Vice President Biden and his son Hunter?
Are you talking to me?
Yeah, it was just a follow-up of what I just asked you, sir.
You ready? We have the president of Finland. Ask him a question.
Vermont independent senator and 2020 presidential candidate Bernie Sanders underwent surgery for a blocked artery after he complained of chest pain at a campaign event in Las Vegas Tuesday night. Sanders' campaign says the senator had 2 stents inserted into an artery, a common procedure that's performed more than 500,000 times a year in the United States. Patients are typically released from the hospital a day or 2 after the surgery. Sanders' rivals for the Democratic nomination issued statements of support, as did many members of Congress. In a tweet Wednesday, Senator Sanders thanked his well-wishers and said he's feeling good. He added, quote, "I'm fortunate to have good health care and great doctors and nurses helping me to recover. None of us know when a medical emergency might affect us, and no one should fear going bankrupt if it occurs. Medicare for all," Senator Sanders wrote. In Iraq, at least 18 people are dead, more than 800 others wounded, after police and soldiers reacted with violence to anti-government protests across Iraq. Some of the deaths and injuries came in Baghdad's Tahrir Square, as police fired tear gas and live ammunition into a crowd of hundreds. Police also opened fire on protesters in the southern city of Nasiriyah. Thousands more demonstrated in cities, including Hilla, Basra, Kirkuk, and Tikrit. Many of them chanted a popular refrain from the Arab Spring: "The people demand the fall of the regime," as they protested against unemployment, corruption, and lack of public services.
We're demanding a change. We want the downfall of the whole government.
Our demands: we want work. We want to work. If they do not want to treat us as Iraqis, then tell us we are not Iraqi, and we'll find other nationalities and migrate to other countries.
Authorities have issued curfews in a number of cities while cutting off internet access across much of Iraq. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson Wednesday unveiled his long-awaited plan to leave the European Union, claiming the United Kingdom is prepared for a no-deal Brexit. Under Johnson's plan, Northern Ireland would leave the EU's customs union in 2021, along with the rest of the UK, but could keep its free-flowing border with the Irish Republic by maintaining European Union trade rules. Johnson outlined his plan at a conference of his ruling Conservative Party.
This is not an anti-European party. This is not an anti-European country. We are European. We love Europe. I love Europe anyway. I love it.
In Brussels, the head of the European Union Parliament's Steering Committee on Brexit, Philippe Lamberts, called Johnson's plan inconsistent and warned that a disastrous no-deal Brexit is looming.
He claims to love Europe, to embrace Europe, by leaving it. Come on, how can this be serious? So what we are confronted with is a nationalist.
Meanwhile, Prime Minister Johnson's spokesperson said Wednesday the Prime Minister would seek to suspend Parliament again from October 8th to 14th, ahead of the October 31st deadline for Britain to leave the European Union. In Hong Kong, pro-democracy demonstrations are continuing after authorities said they've arrested an 18-year-old protester who was shot by police during violent protests Tuesday. The student, Sang Chi Kin, has been charged with assaulting a police officer and may face additional rioting charges. On Wednesday, protesters smashed surveillance cameras and machines at subway stations. Elsewhere, some protesters used gasoline bombs to set a police station on fire. Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam has scheduled a meeting of cabinet officials for Friday, where she's expected to announce sweeping new emergency powers that'll include a ban on protesters using masks at demonstrations, whether it's to hide their identities or to protect against tear gas. In the eastern Atlantic, Hurricane Lorenzo struck the Azores on Wednesday, lashing the Portuguese territory with high winds and heavy surf as it passed just west of the archipelago as a Category 2 storm. At its peak, Lorenzo became a monster Category 5 cyclone with sustained winds of 160 miles per hour, the most powerful hurricane ever observed so far north and east in the Atlantic. It's now threatening to strike Ireland as a rare extratropical cyclone with near hurricane force winds. A recent study by British climate researchers found warmer ocean temperatures driven by human activity could triple the number of such storms by the end of the century. In more climate news, protesters with the activist group Extinction Rebellion used a fire engine and hoses to spray hundreds of gallons of fake blood outside the British Treasury in London Thursday, covering part of the building in red liquid. The protesters also displayed a banner reading, "Stop funding climate death." At least 2 people were arrested. One of the activists told Reuters, quote, "The red symbolizes the people dying now in the global south and also the people who are going to start dying from climate change all around the world if we do nothing." In California, a 37-year-old immigrant from Cameroon died Tuesday after he fell ill in an ICE prison. In a statement, ICE said the man, Bani Abienwe, became partially paralyzed after suffering a brain hemorrhage in the middle of the night at Otay Mesa Detention Center. ICE says he was rushed to a San Diego hospital but died after undergoing treatment. The immigration jail is operated by Core Civic, a for-profit prison corporation. In a statement, Lisbeth Alban of the Inland Coalition for Immigrant Justice said, quote, "The ongoing loss of life in immigration detention is not only heartbreaking, it's infuriating. There's a bill sitting on Governor Gavin Newsom's desk right now waiting to be signed that would ban private detention, like Otay, from California. People in detention cannot afford to be behind bars a second longer. Newsom needs to sign now," unquote. Later in the broadcast, we'll have more on the campaign to end the for-profit prisons here in California. Opera superstar Placido Domingo said Wednesday he's resigning as the director of the Los Angeles Opera amidst multiple allegations of sexual misconduct in the workplace spanning 3 decades. Since August, at least 20 women told reporters Domingo regularly harassed them and tried to pressure them into sexual relationships. Several say he forcibly kissed them or touched them without consent. In some cases, he called them incessantly at home, including late at night. In New York, a federal judge in Brooklyn has denied bail to R. Kelly, setting a trial date of May 18th for the singer to face charges of racketeering, kidnapping, the sexual exploitation of children, and sex trafficking. Kelly is currently behind bars in Chicago, where he faces related federal charges of aggravated criminal sexual assault involving women and girls. His trial in Chicago federal court is set to begin April 27th. A court in Dallas, Texas, has sentenced white former police officer Amber Geiger to 10 years in prison for shooting dead her upstairs neighbor, Botham Jean, a 26-year-old black man, in his own home in 2018. In a remarkable scene following the sentencing, Botham Jean's younger brother, Brant, said during a victim's impact statement that he forgave Amber Geiger and wished she would not serve any time in prison.
Again, I love you as a person, and I don't wish anything bad on you. I don't know if this is possible, but can I give her a hug, please? Please?
The pair then embraced for a minute. State District Judge Tammy Kemp later hugged Botham Jean's family members before turning to Amber Geiger, handing her a Bible and embracing her as well. Geiger will be eligible for parole in 5 years. Outside the courtroom, protesters condemned the sentence as too lenient, chanting, "No justice, no peace." She'd face 5 to 99 years in jail. Protesters later marched through the streets, blocking an intersection near the courthouse. One woman was tackled to the pavement and arrested by riot police. And in Nevada, anti-war groups say 10 activists were arrested Wednesday as they held a nonviolent civil disobedience protest against U.S. drone attacks outside the gates of Creech Air Force Base northwest of Las Vegas. The base is home to drone operators who pilot deadly drones for both the U.S. military and the CIA in missions across Afghanistan and the Middle East. The protest comes just weeks after a U.S. drone strike in Afghanistan killed 30 civilian farm workers who were resting in a field after harvesting pine nuts. 40 others were injured. In a statement, protest organizer Toby Blomé said, quote, "Men, women, and children are violently murdered on suspicion alone, for standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, for just living their lives, for being or of the wrong race or culture, for attending a wedding, for picking pine nuts. It has to stop now," he said. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting today from San Francisco, where President Trump is continuing an all-out attack on the city's homeless population and political leaders. On Wednesday, the Trump administration filed an environmental notice of violation against San Francisco, falsely claiming the city's homelessness crisis has caused water pollution. This is Trump announcing the move in a tirade against House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, whose home district is San Francisco.
She should focus on her own district. Do you see what's happening to her district? We call it tent city. It's terrible. In fact, we just sent a violation to the city of San Francisco. Unsafe water, unsafe conditions, environmental. EPA, our EPA, which is doing a great job, is sending Nancy Pelosi, with all the talk about EPA, there's needles and drugs all over the street. There's tents. There's people that are dying in squalor. In the best location in San Francisco. It used to be a great city. Now you have to see what's happened to San Francisco. You happen to see what the Democrats have allowed to happen.
City officials have repeatedly rejected Trump's unfounded claims that homelessness is connected to water quality. The EPA's action comes a week after Environmental Protection Agency Chief Andrew Wheeler said in a letter to California Governor Gavin Newsom that California is failing to enforce the Clean Water Act. Wheeler has also threatened to pull billions of dollars in federal highway funding to California, accusing it of having the worst air quality in the United States. A spokesperson for Governor Newsom has called Trump's moves political retribution against California, plain and simple. California is home to 12% of the country's population, but half of the country's unsheltered homeless people. President Trump has been pushing for a crackdown on the crisis for weeks. The Washington Post reported last month Trump ordered the White House officials to launch this effort and that his administration is considering actions like destroying homeless encampments. California Congressman Ro Khanna told the Washington Post, yet again, this is bravado for Trump's base with no interest in the actual policy experts' recommendations to solve an issue, Khanna said. For more, we're joined here in San Francisco by two guests. Jennifer Friedenbach is the executive director of the Coalition on Homelessness, and Paul Bowden is the executive director of the Western Regional Advocacy Project, or WRAP, a homeless advocacy group. He was formerly homeless himself. Jennifer Friedenbach, let's begin with you. The attack by President Trump, specifically on California, on San Francisco, saying that homeless people are responsible for water pollution. Can you respond overall?
Yeah, I mean, it's ridiculous on a few fronts. First of all, of course, San Francisco filters its water. There's no link to water pollution. But more importantly is that Trump himself is in a position where he could truly address this crisis. We have a situation where we have, in San Francisco, about 21,000 people experiencing homelessness every year, and that can be traced right back to his feet. He has been engaged in massive cuts to HUD. He's also done inaction in restoring the HUD budget, which is where the roots of this crisis begin when, the HUD budget has been cut so dramatically starting in the late 70s and through the early 80s and has continued since, just this divestment from ensuring that people in the U.S. have a safe and decent place to call home. So it's really ironic that he's complaining about it and then causing the problem and doing nothing to solve it.
Well, I'd like to turn to HUD Secretary, that's Housing and Urban Development Secretary Ben Carson, discussing California's housing crisis on Fox News last month.
A lot of these people have mental health issues. A lot of them have drug addiction. Some of them simply have fallen on hard times and don't know how to deal with it. But as a compassionate society, it is something that we have to do something about. We can't just talk about it. Should it be the responsibility of the federal government? No. These are local problems, and the things that work best are when the local authorities take appropriate attention to these problems, and then the federal government can help them, the state government can help them.
So that's HUD Secretary Dr. Ben Carson. Paul Bowden, if you could respond.
Yeah, it's so profoundly ridiculous that this is the person that's running HUD. When you look at the 1937 Housing Act that created HUD, it said very clearly in that legislation that it was the federal government's responsibility to ensure that people have a clean, safe, adequate place to live. In 1998, they amended that to say the federal government cannot be held accountable to do that during the welfare reform of the Newt Gingrich and signed by Clinton. But the reason HUD was created, and this is the individual charged with administering that federal department, is to ensure housing is available to poor people throughout the United States. And this isn't a California or a San Francisco issue. California may have a larger number of people according to HUD's point-in-time head count, but that's because they go out on January 25th every other year and do a head count, and that's how they come up with the number of homeless people in the United States. That's ridiculous, and of course warm weather climates are going to have a higher number. We don't know what the number of homeless people is with any specificity because it's something that poor people go in and out of all the time. This is a federal responsibility to ensure that people in the United States have a decent place to live that they can afford. And we now spend $54 billion a year in 2004 constant dollars, less on affordable housing than we did before the homeless crisis kicked in the early 1980s. Restore that funding, look at the cause and effect of eliminating that funding, and you'll see the numbers of homeless people go way down because we all know nothing ends homelessness like a home.
I'd like to turn to San Francisco Mayor London Breed, talking about the causes of homelessness in San Francisco. She was interviewed on PBS last month.
Housing affordability is at the core of what I know is a challenge for even middle-income families struggling to live in San Francisco. Between 2010 and 2015, in the city, we concentrated on jobs. We have a 2.6% unemployment rate, but during that same time, for every 8 jobs we created 1 unit of housing. And then it was like a battle between people who were moving here, people who have lived here, folks were being pushed out of communities that they were born and raised in, like my friends and family, and including the public housing I grew up in. It was 300 units. It was torn down and only 200 units were built. So there were a lot of mistakes that were made around housing and housing production and around affordable housing in particular. Because if we don't have the places for people to live that they can afford to live in, that's a big part of why we see even more people living in their vehicles.
That's San Francisco Mayor, the mayor of San Francisco, London Breed. She grew up in public housing. Paul Bowden, you also were homeless for a time. Can you talk about how you were able to, well, you say nothing solves homelessness like a home. Talk about what happened with you and how you ended up not being homeless.
I mean, my circumstance of ending up homeless was rather different than what we see in the streets today, or even what we saw in the early 1980s. Mine wasn't a HUD-related issue. It was something that I think we've experienced for years. There was so many fewer of us. My mom died, and my father didn't want us there. So we ended up bouncing around in the streets. I got very fortunate in that I ended up at Hospitality House in the Tenderloin, a community organization that way predates the advent of contemporary homelessness. And I became part of a fabric of a community in addressing the fact that so many of our neighbors and our community members were finding themselves with nowhere to live. And I actually was able to use the experience that I was going through and how I was, get over feeling sorry for oneself by helping out other community members that are even in a worse place than you're in. And that's how we should be managing this issue. This homelessness should not be a career choice for people, and poverty shouldn't be a career choice for people. We should be looking at how to systemically address the massive economic inequalities that we see, the commodification of healthcare, the commodification of housing, education. We're commodifying our public parks and our public streets through business improvement districts that are now running whole neighborhoods. So we need to understand that neoliberalism is killing our country. And we need to really understand that there's a massive human rights organizing campaign, like with the Poor People's Campaign. Like, we have to connect these issues and understand that it's not a San Francisco issue. Like, homelessness exists. There's 62,000 shelter beds in New York City. There's over 50,000 in Chicago, over 40,000 in LA. This is a serious problem that's been around since Reagan cut the affordable housing budget in the early 1980s, and we're all living Reagan's wet dream of neoliberalism in America. He called it the Reagan Revolution. London Breed talked about the units being torn down and replaced with fewer units. She didn't mention that the new units are all mixed income units. So only a third of the people that were living in the public housing buildings that Clinton, under Hope 6, tore down were ever able to get back into those units, and family homelessness went sky high when that program was implemented in the 1990s.
Jennifer Friedenbach, can you talk about the connection between gentrification and homelessness? I mean, San Francisco, the enormous disparity in wealth, the tech-com boom here, the tech companies that have just changed the landscape of this city.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we had an existing homeless crisis that was dramatically worsened. We have a situation where today it's so hard to get off the streets because those informal housing arrangements, or being able to move into a residential hotel, share a room, all these, even living in a garage. I mean, all of these options have basically disappeared. The real estate speculation here is out of control. And we have thousands of folks who lose their housing in San Francisco and end up homeless. And for many of them, they're stuck homeless because there's really not a way out. And, that's a big reason why we saw a 30% increase in homelessness with this last homeless count, was because of this. And estimates are between about, while we have some housing for homeless folks in San Francisco, there's, for every one housing unit, we have about 2 or 3 people who are stuck homeless. And we have a couple more people for each unit that are becoming homeless every year. So this is a huge issue. And, who we're talking about primarily is who gets preyed on. And you can look at the eviction data and see it. It's seniors, it's people with disabilities. The poor communities where people of color lived have been particularly targeted. We have rent control in San Francisco, but we don't have vacancy control. So what that means is that if a landlord gets the household out, they could jack up the rent as much as they like. So there's this huge incentive among real estate speculators to push tenants out, and then that way they can rent the unit or sell off the unit at much higher income. So it's a massive problem, and that's why we're seeing up and down the West Coast such a dramatic rise in homelessness.
Certain neighborhoods in San Francisco have begun to place boulders, big, gigantic rocks on sidewalks to keep people from setting up tents on the sidewalks. Is that true, Jennifer?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty emblematic of, the lack of any kind of action on this issue. We're not going to solve this issue, and it's tough for the neighbors, of course, to have homelessness out there, but it's so much worse for the folks who are homeless. I mean, we're talking about losing decades off your life through this experience. We're talking about really just, massive misery, and the city's primary response is a police response, like cities across the country, to move folks from place to place. In this particular situation, this encampment had been moved around basically in a circle instead of, solutions coming forward to get folks off the streets and into housing.
So let's talk. Yeah. Let's talk about those solutions. For example, what do you think of presidential candidate Bernie Sanders' housing plan?
I've looked at that really closely, and it's exactly the kind of thing that we need to be talking about. I think it's kind of troubling that it took Trump to bring it up, though, for this to become infused into the presidential debate. I mean, Bernie's had this in his platform for a while, but I'm really hopeful that the other Democratic candidates will look at this as well, because what's going on here? I mean, we have millions of people who can't afford housing on minimum wage jobs. We have folks with disabilities and elders that are out on our streets. We have families with children. I mean, in San Francisco alone, we have 3,000 children that experience homelessness every year. We have pregnant women who are ending up in preterm labor, mostly African American. This is affecting 2 more generations to come. And so it's really time to get serious. One of our members just the other day lost her, she was pregnant and lost her baby. And you know, this is really a very dramatic situation. It's a huge human rights issue that this country is facing. The things about Bernie's platforms that are really positive is he's looking at investing in public housing and improving the conditions and expanding public housing. He's also got in there the creation of new social housing, which is kind of a type of public housing where you have childcare and a kind of democratic self-governance that's in place. That's a really beautiful concept used in Europe and different places. But, you know, we need to make sure that poor people in this country have a safe and decent place to call home, just as a basic, because there's this massive disparity everywhere in the country, not just in the West Coast. Every city in the country has the same problem. There's no place where you can really afford rent on a minimum wage job. You're overpaying or you don't have enough to cover it. And so we really would like to see this be taken a lot more seriously.
According to the New York Times, the median home price in San Francisco is $1.3 million. Paul, a headline in the San Francisco Chronicle at the end of July, Alameda County agrees to lease former jail to Oakland for homeless shelter. As we begin to wrap up, if you can say what, at this point, you feel needs to be done.
I think that the VA needs to get back into providing housing for veterans. I think the United States Department of Agriculture needs to reinvigorate and refund its housing program. They used to build over 30,000 units a year of affordable housing in rural communities. Those programs are completely and totally gone. I think that HUD needs to replace the $54 billion a year, and this is every year over now 35 years. Homelessness is not new. These boulders are not new. The state of California puts out boulders all the time. The city of Portland, Oregon puts out boulders to keep people from camping there. These neighbors didn't just make this up. They're emulating what it is that they see their local and state governments doing. The federal government, all the candidates for Democrat or for Republican should be looking at the role of HUD in ensuring that people have a decent place to live, because housing that isn't a commodity, that is for people, is a worthwhile housing program, just like the homeowner housing subsidy program through the IRS, which is over $140 billion a year. If we can afford $140 billion a year in housing subsidies for homeowners, we sure as hell can do better than $34 billion a year in housing subsidies for poor people.
Well, I want to thank you both for being with us. And of course, we're going to continue to follow this issue, not only in San Francisco and Los Angeles, but around the country. I want to thank Jennifer Friedenbach, Executive Director of the Coalition on Homelessness, based here in San Francisco, and Paul Bowden, Executive Director of WRAP. That's the Western Regional Advocacy Project, a homeless advocacy group. When we come back, the Trump administration recently revoked California's authority to set stricter auto emission standards, but the state is fighting back. Stay with us.
He was just an American dream. He was just an American dream. Yeah, yeah. Just an American dream. He was just an American dream. you come down without a sword or a gun. For the gold and the silver you're searching is hidden out there underground. But there's a beast on the cloak, guarding against.
By J.S. Sundara. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're on the road in San Francisco. The Golden State is in a legal battle with the Trump administration over tailpipe emissions, air quality, climate change. California recently joined nearly 24 other states to file a lawsuit against the Trump administration after it revoked California's air pollution standards for cars and light trucks in its latest regulatory rollback of laws aimed at slowing the climate crisis. This is California Attorney General Javier Becerra addressing reporters last month.
Our message to those who claim to support states' rights: don't trample on ours. Doing so would be an attempt to undo the progress we've made over the past decades. We can't afford that here in California. We cannot afford to backslide in our battle against climate change. For us, this is about survival. Our communities are screaming for help to address the climate crisis. Unlike the Trump administration, we don't run scared. It's clear that the stakes are high for California. It's clear to consumers across the country, and it's clear even to automakers who are embracing cleaner cars.
The Trump administration's move seeks to cancel California's agreement with Ford, Honda, Volkswagen, and BMW that would see passenger vehicles average about 50 miles per gallon by 2026. The Trump administration's proposed freezing auto efficiency at 2020 levels are around 37 miles a gallon. Auto emissions are California's single largest source of greenhouse gases. Late last month, Minnesota and New Mexico joined 10 other states in adopting California's more stringent air quality rules in a rebuke to the Trump administration. Well, for more, we are here in San Francisco and in Los Angeles. There, we're joined by Mary Nichols, the longtime chair of the California Air Resources Board. She's led the board in crafting California's internationally recognized climate action plan. Mary Nichols is known as the Queen of Green. And here in San Francisco, we're joined by Michael Brune, Executive Director of the Sierra Club. Mary Nichols and Michael Brune, welcome to Democracy Now! Mary Nichols, let's begin with you. What exactly is the Trump administration trying to do?
Well, they announced now almost 2 years ago their goal, which is to eradicate the standards that had been voluntarily agreed to by the state, the federal government, and the auto industry under President Obama. So this is part of the broader campaign to erase from the books every accomplishment, really, of the Obama administration. But in this case, the argument was that they needed to give relief to the auto industry by eliminating these standards, which have required the industry to produce slightly more efficient, cleaner cars every year, going back to 2012 and out to 2025. So what they're doing is they're just stopping the program where it is instead of moving ahead.
So what is the response of these auto companies? I mean, usually you're on the other side of these companies, demanding that they be regulated. But it seems now you're coming together on the same side, that the Trump administration has united you.
Well, the industry, having agreed to these standards in the first place, did ask for some changes. They wanted a little more time. They wanted a little more flexibility in how to meet the standards. They didn't ask for the program to go away. And there were a couple of reasons for that, the main one being that they're in a very competitive global market now where every one of the companies wants to be making and selling cars in China, in India, in the developing world. So they have all made commitments to move into zero-emission vehicles, battery electric vehicles, advanced hybrids, fuel cell vehicles. And California has been working with the industry on these plans and had been collaborating with them to make sure that the program could be effective, but also something that the industry could live with. What the Trump administration has been trying to do goes way too far. And when the companies, through their chief executive officers, told the president that, he just said they didn't know what was good for them.
Michael Brune, I want to bring you into this conversation, head of the Sierra Club. Nearly 24 states have sued to block the Trump administration from undoing California's authority to set strict car pollution rules, one of the biggest U.S. battles over climate change. Talk about the significance of this lawsuit.
Sure. Well, as Mary noted a couple minutes ago, oil is now the largest source of climate pollution, not just here in California, but across the country and even around the world. As coal has begun to come down, oil now is the largest source of this climate emergency. And we can speak really plainly in saying that these regulations are actually working. The safeguards that were put in place by Obama have done a great job in cutting climate pollution, not just in California, but across the country, and also saving people money at the gas pump, while also creating lots of jobs. And so there are two issues that are at play, and the lawsuits from 22 states and the city of Los Angeles, city of New York, and separate but complementary lawsuits from the Sierra Club and other organizations are looking to protect those standards and continue the transition away from fossil fuels, away from oil, and moving towards clean electric vehicles and other zero-polluting vehicles, but then also to protect the right that California has, that is enshrined in the Clean Air Act, to set strong standards, to protect public health, to create jobs, to save money, and to cut pollution. So those are the two issues that are at play. And just like every lawsuit that environmental organizations in other states have filed against this administration, we're confident we're going to win, because what we have seen is that this administration is sloppy, they are reckless, they don't use the facts, they don't follow the science. And that pattern of behavior from this administration is really difficult to defend in court. And so we expect to win. We will fight this vigorously, and we will prevail.
Also, there was just a new study that came out. Driving is not just an air pollution and climate change problem. Turns out it just must be the largest contributor of microplastics in California coastal waters. That's one of many new findings released Wednesday from the most comprehensive study to date on microplastics in California. Rainfall washes more than 7 trillion microplastics, much of it tire particles, left behind on streets into San Francisco Bay each year, an amount 300 times greater than what comes from microfibers washing off polyester clothes or microbeads from beauty products. I'm reading from phys.org news. If you can comment on this as well, Michael.
Sure, I did see that study, and seeing it gives me comfort that there's people like Mary Nichols here in California who are beginning to explore these issues. It causes me some alarm to think about Bernhardt at the Interior Department, or Andrew Wheeler, a former coal lobbyist running EPA, or Trump and Pence, who continue to ignore science and who continue to give benefits to some of the biggest polluters in this country. What we know is that here in California, but also in several dozen states across the country, we are beginning to find a way to help people to get from place to place, either in vehicles that pollute a lot less, or moving towards electric vehicles, or by moving to other forms of clean transportation, using mass transit, living closer to where we work and play. There's a variety of solutions that we can put into place at the state and at the federal level to cut all forms of pollution and improve our quality of life. This is what the environmental movement is doing in concert with private industry and with state regulators. And again, we are facing fierce headwinds coming from this administration on almost every front.
Mary Nichols, what do you have to say to President Trump? And what is the biggest problem you're facing in California right now around the climate crisis and the EPA going after California and also overall deregulating? You know, whether we're talking about coal power plants, whether we're talking about deregulating, you know, restrictions on energy companies in general.
Sure. Well, it wasn't lost on most people when Andrew Wheeler, the head of the Environmental Protection Agency now, sent a letter to California criticizing us for the fact that we still have some very persistent, troublesome areas where we don't meet the federal health standards for air quality, and we've been working diligently to bring that down over the years. We've had a lot of success, but we also still have quite a bit of work to do. The problem of global warming actually makes air pollution worse because heat in and of itself causes whatever emissions are in the air to turn into air pollution more quickly and more completely. So it's really a vicious circle. So at the same time that he's critiquing us for the fact that our air is not as good as we want it to be, he's also taking away, or trying to take away, the biggest tool that we have, which is our ability to set more progressive standards for the new motor vehicles, cars, trucks, buses, et cetera, in order to make sure that we don't do anything that might possibly restrict emissions of greenhouse gases. So it's honestly, it's a ridiculous situation that the Trump administration has now gotten itself into, where in their great desire to deregulate and take away California's authority, at the same time they are eliminating the tool that has proven over the years to be the most effective one that we and all the other states that choose to use our standards have found in order to make our air healthier for our people.
Mary Nichols, can you talk more about Minnesota and New Mexico becoming the latest states to embrace both of California's strict rules on tailpipe emissions and zero-emissions vehicles? Why this is so important at this point when the Trump administration is taking on California and how this affects those states?
Sure. I think that the sign that we're doing something that makes sense, not just for California, but for people around the country, is that governors in other states who don't want to necessarily even use the word California standards when they move in this area have recognized that we need to be all moving in the direction of the cleanest, most efficient vehicles that are out there. The auto industry, and Minnesota has some auto-related industry, but mostly that's not their principal economy. But they do have pockets of pollution, and they are troubled with, wanting to be part of the movement that's going on around the world in the direction of transportation, which is cleaner and more efficient, and they'd like to be a home for some of the advanced technologies that are now emerging. They've seen that new companies are actually rising up to produce some of the newer zero-emission vehicles, and I think they would like to be a part of that.
And finally, Michael Brune, the effect of the climate activism that we are seeing not only in the United States, but all over the world. I mean, just last week, young people walking out of school throughout California, around the country, around the world, millions and millions and millions of people marching to deal with the climate crisis. What do you think is going to be the direction of climate activism, and where do you see this all coming to a head with President Trump?
Sure. I think the effect of the protests that we've seen in the marches has been profound. My own children were marching on Market Street just last week. And what we're seeing, as you mentioned, is millions of people who are demanding strong action. And what we are also seeing is that we're seeing heads of state, Here in California, 7 other states in the United States have committed to move to 100% clean energy, moving off of all fossil fuels. We have seen more than 100 mayors of cities across the United States beginning to make the same commitment to get off of all fossil fuels and move to 100% clean, renewable energy. We're seeing the largest companies in the country and around the world, companies like Salesforce and Walgreens, IKEA, Starbucks, and many others, make the same commitment to get off of all fossil fuels. And what we're starting to see is an increasing willingness by governors, by state regulators, by people across all of civil society, except the Trump administration, to actually face this crisis and realize that we don't just have an obligation to act, but there's an opportunity to address some of the biggest challenges that we face in this country. We can revive our economy. We can put millions of people to work in good, high-quality, well-paying jobs. We can cut air and water and climate pollution all at the same time by challenging our leaders to move off of fossil fuels and move towards clean energy. I think it's an inspiring time, and we're starting to see strong action almost everywhere except inside Washington, D.C., and except from this administration.
Well, Michael Bruno, I want to thank you for being with us, Executive Director of the Sierra Club. He's based here in San Francisco. And Mary Nichols, Chair of the California Air Resources Board, has led the board in crafting California's internationally recognized climate action plan. She's known as the Queen of Green. When we come back, the California legislature has voted to ban private for-profit prisons, including private immigration jails. The bill's now awaiting the governor's signature. Stay with us.
Think I'm a mess. Maybe someday, but now you're gone. When I do as I please, I'm no different to me. Am I crazy or have good luck? You're the talk of the town, so you say. I don't know why you're so glad when my head's filled with sorrow. So maybe if I fade away, there'll be no sad tomorrow. My whole life is a drag. If you listen to me, will I go away? Will you care? I feel naked and weird. Do you see what I hear? Maybe one day I'll die. Who cares? Hide away in complete misery. I don't know why you're so glad.
Sad Tomorrow by the Muffs, a band from Southern California. Singer Kim Shattuck passed away from complications of ALS on October 2nd. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In California, a 37-year-old immigrant from Cameroon died Tuesday after he fell ill in an ICE prison. In a statement, ICE said the man, Nabani Abienwe, became partially paralyzed after suffering a brain hemorrhage in the middle of the night at Otay Mesa Detention Center. ICE says he was rushed to a San Diego hospital but died after undergoing treatment. The immigration jail is operated by CoreCivic, a for-profit prison corporation. In a statement, Lisbeth Albeln of the Inland Coalition for Immigrant Justice said, quote, "The ongoing loss of life in immigration detention is not only heartbreaking, it's infuriating. There's a bill sitting on Governor Gavin Newsom's desk right now waiting to be signed that would ban private detention like Otay from California. People in detention cannot afford to be behind bars a second longer. Newsom needs to sign now," she said. Albeln was referring to the bill that California lawmakers passed last month banning private prisons statewide in a major blow to the for-profit prison industry in the U.S. We're joined now by Hamid Yazdan Panah, an immigration attorney with the California Collaborative for Immigrant Justice. You were seminal in the shaping of this bill. If you could start off by explaining just what this bill exactly says.
Yes, so this bill actually sends a very clear message that people are not commodities and that the state of California values people over profits, and that corporations should no longer be allowed to profit off of the incarceration or the detention of California residents.
And it has been passed by both houses in the California legislature?
Yes, it has.
And what is the governor's intention here? What do you understand? He has yet to sign it, but it was just passed.
Yeah, we expect the governor will do the right thing and that he'll uphold the campaign promises that he made. He did state during his campaign that he would seek to end for-profit prisons in California, and we expect him to continue to do the right thing with respect to this bill.
So what does it mean? What would happen in California? How much of the California prison system and immigration jail system is run by for-profit companies?
Well, so as it stands right now, there are 4 major private facilities that house detainees in the immigration context in California. Those facilities are operated by large for-profit entities, and those facilities would no longer be allowed to renew their contracts. A number of those facilities actually are, rife with immigration abuse. One of those facilities, the Adelanto facility, is actually the second deadliest facility in the entire nation. And so what will essentially happen is that these facilities will no longer be allowed to continue their contracts. And hopefully it means the end of for-profit immigration detention in California.
So can you talk about this latest death and how it fits into this picture?
Yeah, one of the reasons why for-profit facilities are so problematic is that they don't have the same degree of transparency and accountability that you would expect from an institution which deprives people of their liberty. And so we've seen over and over again that these private facilities don't care about medical conditions, they don't care about transparency, they don't care about accountability, and they treat people essentially like commodities. They're incentivized to do that. That's their entire business operation, is to treat people like commodities. They don't care about, conditions across the board. And so this bill very squarely sends a message that California will no longer allow this practice to continue. And the deaths that we've seen are a direct result of a combination of horrific policies by this administration in the context of immigration detention. Immigration detention as a whole is needless. People do not need to be detained in the context of immigration and civil proceedings. And to add to that, the for-profit detention of immigrants is abhorrent. It's morally reprehensible. It's something that in 10 to 20 years from now we'll look back on with complete disgust. And I think this bill is the first step in ending that.
The first death at an ICE jail in this fiscal year just occurred yesterday at the Otay Mesa detention facility in San Diego, the 37-year-old man from Cameroon. It's the 9th death this year. Almost 200 people have died in ICE detention since 2003. If you can talk about, and immigrant rights groups are calling now for an investigation, of course, into this death. If you can talk about how this connects to the ICE detention facilities, the overall picture with for-profit prisons. ICE has contracts with for-profit centers, particularly the GEO Group, that are supposed to expire this year. Will the bill prevent these contracts from being renewed? But start off with the particular Cameroonian man who died yesterday.
Yes, so overall, within the context of conditions, like I said before, the private facilities lack transparency. The Attorney General of California actually has a mandate to be able to investigate the conditions of these facilities, and they were actually denied access in their initial inquiry into the private detention facilities in California. So again, we've seen that there's a lack of accountability and transparency in these facilities, which lead to things like deaths in detention, people suffering. And so this bill, again, will remove the for-profit incentive from these companies in running these facilities, and hopefully that results in less people being detained within the context of these for-profit facilities, and overall less people dying in these facilities.
Well, I want to thank you very much for being with us. Of course, we'll continue to follow this and whether or not the governor signs this ban on for-profit prisons. Hamid Yazdan Panah is an immigration attorney with the California Collaborative for Immigrant Justice. That does it for our broadcast here in San Francisco. We'll be here again tomorrow. Nermeen Sheikh will be speaking tonight in Ithaca, New York at 7 o'clock. Check our website at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warmanoff, Libby Rainey, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Masood, Tarina Nadura, Tay-Marie Astudio, Maria Taracena, and Dennis Moynihan. Mike DeFilippo and Miguel Noguera are engineers. Special thanks to Becca Staley and Miriam Barnard, Julie Crosby, Hugh Grant, David Prude, Ishmael Dara, Vesta Godars, Karl Marxer. I'm Amy Goodman here in San Francisco. Thanks so much for joining us.